As I said, next week I'm going to be in Washington at the Hold Their Feet to the Fire event held by FAIR. And we're going to be, the Federation for American Immigration Reform is the name of the group. But we're there, and I've been there for like 7 or 8 years now doing this. I've also been in Iowa doing the show on that. And we talk so much about immigration reform, and yet we continue to see a blatant attempt in our country to tear down the very walls that are meant to keep people out who are coming here illegally. And that doesn't just mean physical walls. That also means internal walls, because we know a lot of people come here on visas and they overstay those visas and they blend in, and that's that. With us this morning is a guy I consider one of the best experts in the country. He's a former ICE agent for 30 years. He's a senior fellow with CAPS, noted speaker, source in immigration reform and enforcement, has his website at michaelcutler.net. And we are talking about Michael Cutler, and one who is never shy in retiring about letting you know the facts about immigration reform. Michael, my friend, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Gary. It's great joining you, buddy. You know, I'm so pleased with the way you cover the issue. It seems like so many broadcasters and alleged journalists are gutless wonders when you talk about immigration. I just want to put one other website out there. You mentioned CAPS. It's Californians for Population Stabilization. They got a great website, capsweb.org. In fact, they just posted one of my articles last night, so I ask all of your listeners to go check them out, capsweb.org and michaelcutler.net. And you're right. And, you know, I spent half my career with the Drug Task Force. And I have to tell you, the immigration laws have nothing to do with race, religion, or ethnicity. And, you know, if you listen to the Open Borders crowd, and I've come to call them the immigration anarchists, you would think that there's something in the law that says keep out brown skin. It's an outrageous mentality that they have, and they're making crazy assertions that most people don't bother checking. And they refer to people such as us because we think that we should secure the borders against illegal entry, not against everybody. We admit over 1 million lawful immigrants every year. These folks are immediately on a pathway to citizenship. We want to keep out the people who would hurt us. And they refer to us as being anti-immigrant. Well, we're not. We're pro-enforcement. And the very same laws that explain or enumerate who we're supposed to keep out or under what circumstances an alien who violates the law should be deported, those very same laws permit people to acquire political asylum and remain in the United States as refugees, become resident aliens, become United States citizens. The laws are balanced. What's not balanced or reasonable is the approach that the Open Borders crowd is taking, because they're motivated by insatiable greed for wealth or power or both. And that's really what this is about, Gary.
Is it still important to be a country with borders? I'm asking what sounds like a very simple question, and yet I think that it's more complex than that. Is it still important to be a country with borders? Yeah.
Absolutely it is. And you know what's so remarkable, and you know, I've testified, I think we're now up to 16 congressional hearings. I provided testimony to the 9/11 Commission. And if you look at the 9/11 Commission report, and if you look at the findings of the 9/11 Commission staff, you know, the 9/11 Commission spent a lot of time on immigration.
Right.
How did the terrorists enter the United States? How did they game the visa process? How were they able to hide in plain sight? And not just the 9/11 terrorists, but they looked at a total of 94 terrorists who operated in our country in the decade leading up to the attacks of 9/11. They found that of the 94, 59, or roughly two-thirds, used immigration fraud in order to either enter the country, pardon me, or embed themselves. And in fact, I did my own very first, not my own hearing, but I was called before my first hearing in Washington to testify about visa fraud and benefit fraud 4 years after the 93 terrorist attacks and 4 years before 9/11, at the midway point. So everybody understood that the vulnerabilities existed in the way we gave out visas and in the way that we enforced or failed to enforce the immigration laws. And what's so incredible was that on September 11th, 2001, there were 26 so-called visa waiver countries whose citizens did not need a visa in order to come to the United States. And the 9/11 Commission looked at that whole process and said, you know, you got to tighten up the way you give out visas, because this allows people to come into that inspector's booth at the airport or a port of entry somewhere and be admitted. And by the way, we're a country of 50 border states, not just 4 border states.
Exactly.
Any state that has a seaport or lies along our 95,000 miles of meandering coastline, or has an international airport, or lies along the northern or southern border or border states. And in fact, for the first 4 years of my career, I served as an immigration inspector at Kennedy Airport before I became a special agent. So they said, tighten up the process. That was then. We had 26 visa waiver countries. Do you know how many we have now?
Go ahead.
38.
Wow.
We just added Chile.
Yeah.
This is because of the pressure being brought to bear by the National Chamber of Commerce, by the hotel and hospitality industries, by the corporations. You have a push on for comprehensive reform that would provide unknown millions of illegal aliens who evaded the inspections process. Now, that process is cursory. I wish we had more time to do it better. The 9/11 Commission wished that we did. They talked about the inspection process, in fact, in their report, and so did the 9/11 Commission staff report, because the staff looked at what the 9/11 Commission wrote, and these were the investigators and lawyers who worked with the commissioners, and they said, as much attention as they paid to immigration, they didn't do enough. They issued their own report, the 9/11 Commission staff report on terrorist travel. And it was almost as long as the entire 9/11 Commission report. And it was only about immigration and border security and the way that people get identity documents in the United States. They understood how important it was, and they said, as much attention as was paid, we need to put more emphasis on that. So what do? We have people like de Blasio in New York who want to give illegal aliens identity documents, even though we can't verify their identity. The Obama administration is processing so-called dreamers. They're supposed to be kids, but the age cutoff, by the way, folks, is 31. There is no interview. So you mail in your paperwork. If you mark off the right boxes and give them the right little pieces of paper, they will send you an identity document. Do you think they know if that's really you?
Wow.
Now you've got the Obama administration. This is what predicated my visit with you this morning, and those visits are too infrequent, by the way, Gary. I love being on your program.
Okay.
But Breitbart, Matthew Boyle wrote a report, and this was 2 days ago. President Obama's Department of Homeland Security, I call it, by the way, the Department of Homeland Surrender, caught and then released 68,000 aliens who had been previously convicted of a crime. Now think about that. They had 68,000 aliens who were subject to deportation, subject to removal in their hands. They had them. I mean, this is like going to a fish preserve where you catch the fish, you take the hook out, and you throw them back so you can catch them later. I mean, what in the world are we doing? And understand that the immigration laws are not insignificant, which is what Obama, and I got to tell you, some Republicans are trying to convince
Absolutely.
people. They're undocumented. Well, they're also uninspected. So here's the reasonable question that I want everybody in your audience to answer this question, at least in their own mind. We're concerned about getting on an airplane with terrorists. I mean, look what's happening now with the Malaysian airline jet, and I'm going to make a quick point about that momentarily. But the concern is you could get on an airplane and have it turn into a de facto cruise missile. I do a lot of traveling. I do speaking engagements, and if any of you folks out there know of any opportunities, reach me through michaelcutler.net, capsweb.org, and I'm sure Gary will pass the word along to me as well. But would you get on an airplane with uninspected passengers? If you saw somebody sneaking around and then jumping into the airplane without being inspected, would you be willing to get on that airplane? Then why in the world is the Obama administration and members of both houses of Congress from both political parties telling us that it is fair and appropriate that we give these folks who snuck in the ability to remain here with an official identity document, even though we can't figure out with certainty who they are? And I want to read, this is a quick paragraph. This comes from the 9/11 Commission staff report on terrorist travel. This is really important, folks. Once terrorists had entered the United States, their next challenge was to find a way to remain here. Their primary method was immigration fraud. For example, Yusuf and Ajaz concocted bogus political asylum stories when they arrived in the United States. Mahmoud Abu Alima, involved in both the World Trade Center and landmark plots, received temporary residence under the seasonal agricultural worker programs after falsely claiming that he picked beans in Florida. Mohammed Salame, who rented the truck used in the bombing, overstayed his tourist visa. This was the 93 bombing,
right,
by the way. He then applied for permanent residency under the agricultural worker program, but was rejected. Ayad Mahmoud Ismail, who drove the van containing the bomb, took English language classes at Wichita State College in Kansas on a student visa, and after he dropped out, he remained in the United States out of status. So to anybody in the world, this was a college kid who got tired of going to school, just like we've seen kids do, and said, what the heck, I'm going to hang out for a while. Well, guess what? He was hanging out, planning to carry out a terrorist attack that almost brought the towers down sideways. As it was, they injured 1,000, killed 6, and inflicted $500 million on the Trade Center. And here's the final piece I want to read. This comes, again, same report, the 9/11 Commission Staff Report on Terrorist Travel, page 98. Terrorists in the 1990s, as well as the September 11th hijackers, needed to find a way to stay in or embed themselves in the United States if their operational plans were to come to fruition. As already discussed, this could be accomplished legally by marrying an American citizen, achieving temporary worker status, or applying for asylum. There's that word asylum again, right? After entering. In many cases, the act of filing for an immigration benefit sufficed to permit the alien to remain in the country until the petition was adjudicated. Terrorists were free to conduct surveillance, coordinate operations, obtain and receive funding, go to school and learn English, make contacts in the United States, acquire necessary materials, and execute an attack. Now, look at this Malaysian airplane that went down. Look at how the media spins the nonsense. I have to tell you, I was ready to throw a brick at my television. Do you remember about 2 days after the plane went missing, they talked about 2 Iranians on board the airplane who had stolen European passports?
Yes,
2 things to be taken. Number one, Europe participates in the visa waiver program, and they also have the European Union. So European passports in particular are highly valued by people that are up to no good. Number two, the media said, oh, the younger one, 19 years old, he wasn't the problem. He was going to go to Germany to join his mother because he was planning on claiming political asylum. Really? So if you're claiming political asylum, you're not a threat? How frequently did you hear me quoting from that 9/11 Commission staff report where they talked about asylum? The guy that attacked the CIA in 1993, Mir Amil Kansi, shot up the CIA Pakistani national, had applied for political asylum. In addition to Ramzi Youssef, and they mentioned Youssef's name in that paragraph that I read to you. Now look at the Boston Marathon bombing. The Tsarnaev brothers applied for political asylum, and then they went back to Russia. To be able to get political asylum, you have to claim what's known as credible fear. You know, in the Magic Act, the words are abracadabra, and then the rabbit jumps out of the hat. Well, here the magic word is credible fear. If you send me home, things are going to be terrible for me. I'm going to be persecuted, in prison, beaten, whipped, whatever. So what do they do as soon as they got political asylum? They went back to Russia. Now, what does that tell you? They probably lied. They just held 2 hearings over at the House Judiciary Committee. And in December, the hearing was on how members of the Mexican drug cartels have been getting political asylum in the United States. But the media comes out there. They make this proclamation. Oh, he was going to Germany for political asylum. By the way, remember the role of the Hamburg Mosque in the preparations for the 9/11 attacks? That was the meeting point. Now, this kid may be totally blameless. He might have been as pure and clean as fresh-driven snow. I'm not throwing bricks at this kid that was on that airplane. For all we know, he may be dead. We don't know where the airplane is. There's a lot of crazy stories right now circulating. You know, General Paul Vallely, who's become a friend and he's a former commander of Special Forces, has a theory about the plane being on the ground somewhere with some nefarious stuff going on. I don't know if General Vallely is right, but we still don't know. And until we have records, we won't know. But I'm willing to accept that this kid had nothing to do with anything. But what's bothering me isn't the kid that was on the airplane. It's the way the media mistakenly gives information to people, and people think, well, the voice came out of my radio or TV, so it has to be authoritative.
Yeah, you err on the side that probably could hurt you in the long run. Michael, we're going to take a break. We're talking with Michael Cutler, former ICE agent, 30 years, senior fellow with CAPS, noted speaker, and he'll be right back with us to talk more on the 68,000 criminals. By the way, that 68,000 does not include, according to the report I was looking at here, people who are driving under the influence of alcohol or even vehicular manslaughter. Yeah, they're not included in there, even if it resulted in the death of someone. So that's outside of that. That's okay? We'll ask Michael when we come back here on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. Immigration reform on the table here on the Gary Sutton Show. As I said, I'll be in Washington, D.C. next week for Fairs Hold Their Feet to the Fire event. Michael Cutler, good friend and former ICE agent for 30 years and also a senior fellow with CAPS and a constant speaker about this around the country with us this morning. Michael, I had a immigration attorney on earlier this morning, Katrina Moore, who was talking about the 68,000. He said, well, you know, they've deported more during the Obama administration than we've seen in a long time. And so, our jails are filled. So, we don't know about all these 68,000. Maybe they are in the process right now being tried. Maybe they have to come back. And I wanted to get your reaction to that they, continue to hear, well, they've deported more than the Bush administration or anybody else. And the Bush administration was no angel on this either, by the way.
No. I mean, look, anybody who says that is either a fool or needs a nose job because their nose is growing. It's how they count what they call removals. Normally, if the Border Patrol turns somebody around, or if you have a guy attempt entry at an international airport, the inspector says, look, I'm going to give you a choice. It appears to me that if you enter the United States, you're going to work illegally or you're going to do something else. So I'm going to put you before an immigration judge, or you can go home. If you go home, there's no consequences so that at a later date you can come back and try to reenter. So a lot of times aliens will say, okay, you know what, I'll just take my suitcase, get back on the airplane, and I'll fly back to Rome or wherever, name the country. That never was counted. Now they are counting them. If you arrested an illegal alien working somewhere illegally, and they don't do that anymore anyway now, this administration, but let's say you arrest somebody and you give them a choice. Do you want to go before a judge, have a formal hearing, and then if you're deported, you're facing criminal charges. It's a felony to reenter after deportation, or you can opt to return voluntarily so that if you come back at a later date that's not a crime, they opt to go home voluntarily. They never used to count those. So now they're counting all of those as being the equivalent of a deportation. It's kind of like a police officer taking credit for an arrest when he issues somebody a speeding ticket.
Michael, when you look at a lot of the ideas out there, you said something that to me is so simple and yet is so profound. You said immigration is not a single issue, but a singular issue that impacts every challenge and threat confronting the United States today. Yep. Simply stated, the immigration laws were enacted to save lives and protect the jobs of American workers. And then you said this, it is not anti-immigrant to be pro-American. And it seems to me that a lot of people who would say they're pro-American today are running for cover a lot of time, feeling somehow putting themselves in a self-guilt trip. We have about 2 minutes left. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think that we have self-hating Americans and people that have become cowards. One of the things that disturbs me is how we're telling people that if you're being bullied, you have to go to somebody for help. When I was a kid, I was scrawny. I used to get the stuffing beat out of me. So my father said, you're going to go to a gym, you're going to learn to box, you're going to work out. And I did. And all it took were 2 or 3 good fist fights, and they were good because I knocked a couple of people out. I was boxing at that point. And the music stopped. We have stopped defending ourselves. The First Amendment doesn't only talk about freedom of press, speech, and religion, but about the right to seek redress of grievances. And boy, if you don't have grievances today, check for a flatline EEG. And the right for peaceable assemblage so you can have that debate. We have got to start to stand up to the bullies who are trying to intimidate us. And this is all about money. Whether it's the high-tech visas, Ted Cruz and that other bunch, they want to have 3 to 5 times as many high-tech workers admitted into the United States. Why? We have the highest unemployment rate among our high-tech workers and among America's minority groups. We already admit more than 1 million lawful immigrants every year and naturalize more than 500,000 new citizens. That's more than the rest of the world combined. And, I'm a lifelong Democrat. These issues, folks, aren't conservative and they're not liberal. They're American. And the difference between an immigrant and an illegal alien is comparable to the difference between a house guest and a burglar. There is no insult in the term alien. In fact, under the Immigration and Nationality Act, that's that big all-encompassing body of law that we talk about when we speak about the immigration laws, An alien is simply defined as being any person not a citizen or national of the United States. If you can find an insult there, I want to know what it is. This is Orwellian. It is propaganda. And isn't it time that we stood up and be counted? Because the survival of America, in a very real sense, is on the line. If we had enforced the immigration laws after 93, the attacks of 9/11 couldn't have happened.
And we got to end it there, Mike. Always a pleasure. And we will continue the conversation soon, my friend.
Travel safely to Washington. Give them heck.
Thank you so much. Michael Cutler with us here on the Gary Sutton Show this morning. Our quote of the day goes to Mark Twain. 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the things you did. So throw out the bowline, sail away from safe harbor, catch the trade winds in your sails, explore, dream, and discover. And if it comes to our politicians, do a lot of exploring. Thanks so much for joining me today here on the Gary Sutton Show. Tomorrow, Joe Schnetzka will join us. We're also planning on getting Terry Madonna in here as we talk more about what's going on with Obamacare and so many more things that maybe just pop up overnight. If it's happening with you, it's happening with us here on the Gary Sutton Show. Have a great day, everyone. It's high noon.